to the final event in our 2-week Festival of Ideas. It's great to see so many people here, a whole range of people, and a particularly warm welcome to all of our panelists, who I'm going to introduce quite shortly. My name is Ben Wormsley. I'm the director of the Centre for Cultural Value, and in my spare time, an audience researcher. So this topic of the value of online engagement is something that's very close to my heart and something I've been thinking about and researching with lots of cultural organisations for far too long. So I'm really fascinated and intrigued to hear what our panel members are going to say, and of course what all of you are going to add into today's discussion. So a really warm welcome from everyone on behalf of the Centre for Cultural Value. I'm just going to give you a very quick introduction to the Centre and our activities for those of you who haven't been to an event thus far and don't necessarily know exactly what we're all about. So the Centre for Cultural Value is funded in the first instance for 5 years by AHRC, Arts Council England and Paul Hamlyn Foundation. We're a very proud legacy of the AHRC's wonderful Cultural Value project, and it's lovely to see Jeff Crossick here today. I'm sure he'll have quite a lot to feed into the debate. The Centre exists to explore the differences that arts, culture, heritage and screen-based activities make to people's lives and more broadly to society. So we work in collaboration across the cultural sector to explore some of the timeliest questions of cultural value and to work with the sector to produce and develop a shared understanding and develop the evidence base about the value and impacts of culture. So it's great to invite you all to be part of this collective endeavour. We can't do this on our own. We're a very small centre. So everything we do in collaboration with our associate partners, with our associate directors, and with cultural organisations, not just all over the UK, but all over the world. So to move to today's event. Today, we're going to be thinking, as you know, about the value of online engagement. We're going to be having some breakout sessions. We want this event to be as interactive as it possibly can be within the confines, of course, of Zoom. So there'll be plenty of opportunity for people to post questions and reflections and thoughts in the chat. And I'll do my very best to keep my eyes peeled to pick up recurrent themes that we can pose back to our 4 panel members. Please do also take the conversation out of the Zoom space onto the Twitter sphere. So we've got the hashtag of valuing culture. If you want to share ideas on Twitter, that would be wonderful. I'd like to say a huge thanks in advance to Trish, who is doing the live transcription for today's session. So those of you who want to access live transcription, please just use the CC button to turn on the captions in Zoom. Or I think Tamsin's about to post a link that you can click on in the chat as well. Just to confirm, we will be recording this session for use afterwards and for dissemination. So if you don't want to be recorded, then please just switch off your cameras and your microphones, and we'll make sure that you aren't shared publicly. Also to reassure you, we won't be sharing the chat publicly, and we certainly won't be recording the breakout session. So feel free to be as honest as you can be and want to be, and share in the best possible direct way in the breakout groups. We'll be hearing from our invited contributors first. So we're going to have 15 minutes. I've given them the unenviable task of responding to this question of what is the value of online engagement in 3 minutes each. So I'm going to introduce our panel in a second. After that, we'll be having a very short break, a short comfort break, and then the breakout groups I shall try and feed back into the main discussion back to the panel members. So enough from me, a huge warm welcome, and I'm going to very quickly introduce our panel members and then hand over them to give their reflections. So first of all, we're going to have Hassan Bakshi, who many of you will know. Hassan is the director of the AHRC's Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre, who are our partners and collaborators with the Centre for Cultural Value on our COVID-19 work. So Over to you, Hassan.
Thank you, Ben. Hope you can hear me there. So ahead of this event, Ben sort of asked us and me and the other panelists to open up with a provocation. My contention, more than a provocation, is that lockdown and social distancing more generally offers a rich experimental opportunity to understand how and why the public engages with digital culture and how this impacts on their well-being. So take the case of England. We can think of the crisis so far as having played out in 4 phases. In the first, a national lockdown, which was a common shock that hit all the public simultaneously, albeit the impact differed according to the socio-economic characteristics of individuals and families, followed by second, an easing of lockdown restrictions coincident in all parts of the country, followed by a third phase in which different parts of the country went into local lockdown at different points in time, and then followed again by a second national lockdown, of course, albeit one less restrictive than the first. Now, by tracking the evolving behavior of the same group of individuals, but in different circumstances over these periods, we can gain insights into not only how the public engages with culture digitally, but also critically insights as to why, by inferring how behavior changes as a result of lockdown and social distancing, hence my reference to it being an experiment. Now, to exploit this opportunity in partnership with the Intellectual Property Office, we initiated a cohort study very early on in lockdown. So, in the study, we were able to track in detail changing consumption behaviors as they happened, and we were able to publish the findings quickly. How much time they spent listening to music or watching films, for example, what proportion of individuals were downloading versus streaming, what platforms they were using, and how the answers to these questions varied across socioeconomic groups. But we were also able to infer how behaviors had changed as a result of lockdown. In a new report that we're publishing later this month, presenting the results of the 9th and final wave of the study, we found that individuals in our cohort who lived in areas in local lockdown increased their consumption of TV and film, whereas individuals who are not in lockdown did not, suggesting that on average, individuals increased their film and TV consumption as a result of lockdown. We also found that for content like video games, individuals who stopped working because they were furloughed made up a greater share of the game playing population than these same individuals did prior to lockdown. And again, this is suggestive that cultural participation, like playing video games, is important to individuals who are coping with no longer working. So we're still learning more and more about this data, but findings like these raise an obvious question of whether digital culture should be seen as a component in the fight against the pandemic itself, helping the public manage the fallouts from lockdown and the need to socially distance. There's my provocation.
Wonderful, thanks very much, Hassan. A lot to think about there, and I'll pick up on some of those ideas in the Q&A following the panel. So our second speaker, it's a great pleasure to introduce Portia Tremlett. Portia is the Public Programme Engagement Officer at the Novium Museum in Chichester. So over to you, Portia, for your 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can hear me. So I have been asked to reflect a little bit on the things that we've been doing over the summer. So we applied for a little bit of funding from the Art Fund, and we were successful in getting some money to create virtual field trips for schools. So we knew that schools weren't going to be able to engage with museums and heritage organisations in the short term. We knew that this was probably going to end up being the long term. So we wanted to develop a different way of engaging with schools to make sure they still had that experience of learning outside the classroom, but within the classroom. So a brief summary of the field trips that we developed. So they're all Roman themed. We have a very big Roman collection, so we decided to base it on our Roman collection. And there are a couple of different topics. Each topic you get a series of 6 chapters of filmed content, which is a mixture of storytelling, actor-led, museum kind of object and focus-led, classroom activities. You get extra things depending on the kind of the tier that you rent. So throughout kind of developing these kind of things, these field trips are reflecting on kind of the themes that have become quite prominent to me for this panel. I think one of the main things that I think is really important is online engagement really makes you reevaluate what you do. And I think museums and heritage organisations can sometimes get a little stuck in a rut. We tend to do the same events, the same activities. We know that they work, that's why we do them. But you then end up just engaging with the same people and the same audiences. And actually going digital, as it were, makes you really think outside the box and try new things. So, you know, we couldn't just do a school workshop and do it online, because all of our workshops involve handling objects and you just can't do that online. So we had to think very, very carefully about how we were actually going to approach doing an online engagement way of engaging with schools. And I think it's also really important to say that it doesn't have to be either or. I don't think you have to just have digital or just have not digital. The field trips initially was supposed to be a way of engaging schools because we couldn't do workshops. But actually, through the development of them, they very much become another stream of our learning program, and they really complement the rest of the program. And actually, initially, they were supposed to be a way of connecting with our local schools because we couldn't connect with them. But actually, what we think in the future it's going to be is a way of connecting with different schools and schools further afield, because it's just another element of engagement that people can use, as well as our online, as well as our physical workshops and loan boxes and sleepovers and things like that. So I think a really key benefit of online engagement, particularly at the moment, is that it forces you to innovate, which I think is very important for, you know, the cultural sector, particularly at the moment. So those are my thoughts.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Portia. I'm gonna come back and maybe ask all the panelists about what's going to stick post-COVID, but that's really interesting insight into how strategies are evolving amongst our cultural institutions. So thanks very much for that. Okay, third up is Rishi Coupland. Again, many of you will know Rishi already. Rishi is Head of Data Intelligence at the National Theatre, and he's going to share some of his experiences of acting in that role during lockdown. Over to you, Rishi.
Thank you. So back in 2010, I used to manage all the digital output of South Bank Centre, an art centre here in London. And we launched an online game to help promote a musical that was playing into the hoods. And then I found out that this game had been really very successful in Brazil, a place where we hadn't really promoted it. And that was my first brush with online metrics and sort of asking the question, do these metrics actually tell us much that's useful and helpful? Fast forward to 2020, and at National Theatre, we launched National Theatre at Home, really in response to the pandemic, where we were streaming full-length plays on YouTube. And I think I was a bit better prepared about the metrics question. We had digital metrics, but we also had online focus groups, including international focus groups. And we worked with the University of Reading for a framework to measure cultural value of NT at Home using principles of applied neuroscience. So one of my provocations is, if and I think that's probably the minimum it would take for us to actually understand NT at Home, that's how much it takes in terms of measurement. Who's prepared to do that? And who's ready and able to do that as cultural organisations? A second part of the provocation, we saw a lot of different behaviour from audiences as part of NT at Home. And some of it was familiar, some of it was unfamiliar, people skimming the productions or watching them in chunks, people following Twitter along as they went. And we actually found the work with the University of Reading really found actually different cultural values coming through from benefits coming from NT at Home than we normally find anywhere else I've seen in theatre. So I've got a question that if actually online changes the proposition of what you're producing, who's prepared as a creator to embrace their work being remediated, being received in different ways? And the third thing is, we know that audiences don't always do what they say. There's a difference in the brain between intention and action. And in a way, my question is, what are we doing online for? If it's about behavior, and YouTube and Facebook and things like that are great for behavior because they drive mass on-scale audience and participation, then maybe we should embrace that and really look at how the cultural forms can evolve to fit well on those pre-made channels. If it's about values and intention, and I'm thinking about the wider civic duty of organizations, and I'm reading this book, Dana Boyd, It's Complicated book. If it's about creating a network public that really espouses the values that a lot of us have as institutions, how far can we go using platforms like YouTube and Facebook that don't espouse a lot of those values? So that's a provocation there. And really the meta provocation across it all is just, how ready are we as a sector to be serious about digital? Because we've got to answer these questions, and I don't have a position on a lot of these, but I think these are questions that we can and should ask.
That's really helpful. Thanks very much, Rishi. And the focus there on the civic duty of cultural organisations is a beautiful segue to our final speaker, Kim Wilde, who is the founder and CEO of Take Apart. I'm going to hand over to you, Kim, for your 3 minutes.
Hi, Ben. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Take Apart work in Plymouth and the Southwest with communities in a long-term and embedded way, making art where they live, about who they are and what they want to achieve. We work with communities that are high on the socioeconomic deprivation register and underserved, and which have been highly affected by the COVID crisis. Online cultural engagement is and can be very valuable if you have access. We've all seen how it can connect people via online pub quizzes, art clubs, and choirs, and those are great. But in the communities that Take Apart are partnering with and a resident in, we're seeing and experiencing people making hard choices. Where we're working with communities experiencing social injustice due mostly to economic issues, there is a lot of thought at play when it comes to how and what they're prioritizing digitally. Some people have one device in their homes, and they need that to work their 0 hours contract job, perhaps as a delivery driver. They're taking that access out of the home and applying it to where it's needed most, employability. People also have limited data packages and have to make choices. Do you use your data to Skype your grandmother in Ireland, or do you watch theatre online? Do you use it to support your child to do their online learning from home, or do you connect with cultural frameworks? And what do you do if you're older, disabled, or simply don't have the skills or the kit needed to be part of what is becoming an increasingly mainstream offer? The digital divide is real. The Office for National Statistics in 2019 published a study that evidenced 8% of the UK population have zero access, and a further 12% have limited access or skills to access. This is further exacerbated by language barriers that might be part of migrant communities. All of these are, of course, barriers that we all need to be aware of when we're considering our online engagement. We do know that people will find ways to engage with things that are relevant and useful to them. So really, my provocation is about the meaningfulness and the usefulness of online engagement to audiences. For the communities I'm working with, questions would be, what can it give me and my family? Is it a certification so I can gain opportunity for employment? Is it connecting me with my community, my culture, and issues of relevance to where I live and work? Is it supporting opportunities for my children to have better chances to learn and thrive? Is it allowing me to access systems of support? We have used digital recently, and much like Portia was saying, it's been very interesting to us to be forced into that. And it has worked, but it's worked because it's had a usefulness to it. An example of what we've done is that we were able to create a community magazine in Coxside, which allowed residents across the board to connect and understand what food bank opening hours were, how they could get support from their neighbors. We had to use digital platforms to train the residents to be community journalists. And we gave employability to those community members by paying them for their articles. Those community members in turn represented the newspaper opportunity to those who don't have digital access, and it convinced them to write articles as well. We put those publications through everybody's letterbox. So because we had a mixture of digital and analog approaches, everyone in the community could take part in the project. So digital can be great. We've learned a lot, and we are using it more than we have before, and we're considering it more. It has allowed us to connect and to have planning meetings in the community and share updates. And we've enjoyed learning how to use it, but ultimately, we believe that if you are going to engage online, you need to do it with care, relevance, consideration of the usefulness and the value of it to those that you're trying to reach. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kim. Lots to think about there. And so could I invite all of the participants just to pose any questions you have for the panel in the chat, and I shall do my best to keep my eye on the chat. Just to kick us off, I mean, all four of you, I guess, inevitably referred to this question of readiness and implications for cultural organisations of the rise in digital engagement. So I guess my kind of overarching question is to maybe all of you, is how ready do you think most cultural organisations are to embrace digital engagement, to respond to the specific and evolving needs of their audiences and communities? Who'd like to go first before I pick on somebody? Portia, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, because I think if you think about it in terms of museums, a lot of for me, our museum ourselves, we do not have the skills to do digital. We don't have the resources to do digital. The only reason we're managing to do this whole project is because we were given a grant to do it. And within that grant, we're building in sort of training and upskilling to try and continue this into the future. But actually, you know, there are a lot of small museums that are still very much part of the community, are very much there for their, you know, audiences who don't have the skills, they don't have the technology, they can't create things like this. And I think one of, you know, because there's been this influx of online engagement and digital, and everyone thinks, oh, we have to go down this route now. I think very much, you know, it has to be right for your organization, and it has to be right for your audience. And if it's not right for both, then don't even bother, because it's not, you know, it's just meaningless. But yeah, it's an interesting period where everyone's rushing to try and produce something when actually it doesn't have the quality that's needed to make it relevant in today.
Right, thank you. So there's again something there about strategic fit, as ever. Don't do it badly, or don't do it for the sake of doing it. Hassan, I'm going to put you on the spot here, partly because years ago I was involved in a Nesta project that you led, I think, looking at, you know, R&D for digital and the arts to partly address these skills gaps that Portia and Kim have been referring to. I wonder what your thoughts are on addressing the skills gap in the sector.
Yeah, somebody, can you hear me actually?
Yeah.
Oh, great. So we did, yeah, we've been in partnership with Arts Council England, we've been running a longitudinal survey called Digital Culture. And so I think there's been 6 or 7 of these now over the years, where we've gone out and surveyed large numbers of cultural institutions about various aspects of their digital readiness, if you want to think of it in those terms. You get some unsurprising results, right? Smaller institutions are much less report to be less in a position to take advantage of the opportunities that digital affords them, less in a position to do the analysis of audience insight and what their public actually want. Across culture and art forms, you find that collections and museums seem to be particularly in a difficult place from that point of view. One thing I'd say, sort of more anecdotally, based on all the organisations that we work through in that fund, that digital R&D fund you mentioned, Ben, is that what was missing in most, if not all organisations really, was a sense that it was an essential question. So there was still a sense in which digital was a nice to have, and there were individuals within those organisations who may be responsible for marketing, or may be responsible for education outreach, which would be looking at their particular aspect of digital and the opportunities it afforded. But the organization as a whole didn't really engage with the opportunity. And I think that's what's changed. And I think it was Portia who made the point earlier on. We're all being faced to think about and reflect on our lives and what it means to be in digital. And that obviously is an innovation, right? I mean, that is an opportunity for innovation. But I can't profess to have any straightforward answers on this, but I do think there's an urgency that's been lacking uniquely up until now, actually. And I suspect next year, if we were to go back and survey our organizations again this time next year, we'd probably have a very disrupted picture compared with what we've had historically.
Right, thank you. There's a question here for Kim, but before we move tack slightly, I'm just going to pose the same question to Rishi, really. Either the first question about readiness, or the second about the skills gap that you also referred to.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. What Portia said really resonated with me, in that and Portia's work actually being enabled by a grant being essential. I completely agree, because cultural organisations can't often leave what they do in the physical world behind to embrace the digital world. If you're a commercial organisation, you might say, I'm closing these shops and I can then reinvest that into digital. You can't really do that as a cultural organisation. So I think it is really tough to get the resources. I would say, I think that you have to push yourself to try digital, because there's probably no amount of preparation that beats a little bit jumping into the deep end. So I think that you could plan all the resources in the world and still find it a rude shock when you go into that world. So in a way, if you're an organization trying to map how ready you are, you've got to try it, I think. And then you'll know how ready you are. But it does, I think the question of grants to enable that extra activity, I think, is really important. Jeff Crossick put an interesting question in the chat, which was around whether, if you're a completely digital organization, are you more ready? I mean, there's this concept called adaptive capacity. And if you follow the adaptive capacity philosophy, what you'd say is organizations that are really quick at responding at things will have responded better to this crisis and gone digital. Not necessarily organizations which are digital would have been good at this. It might have been that I don't know, but it might have been that the key factor was how good is your capacity to quickly switch through 180 degrees.
Thanks, Rishi. So there's a question here for Kim from Sally Ray. And Sally says, Kim, do you feel it also helped that you were already there working in that community? So there's a question here, isn't there, about having that established relationship with communities, and particularly in relation to the digital, I guess.
Yes, definitely. I mean, when the COVID crisis hit, Take Apart didn't really pivot that much, actually. We were already embedded in communities in a very hyper-local way and a long-term way. So it was just, oh dear, we can't be on the ground now. How are we going to solve that problem? Oh, okay, I know that we know enough people to ring them up and invite them to this opportunity. So yeah, that's really important that we have that relationship, and many larger cultural organizations potentially don't have that relationship. And we saw a lot of them shutting down in the very early stages because there wasn't a lot they could do. But you can, as an organization, pick up the phone and call a food bank, or call your local youth center or school or tenants and residents association, housing associations, and ask them what they need. And as a cultural organization, provide that. This could be your political act as an organization, to just reach out yourself and then find that opportunity. So I don't think you necessarily have to have had an audience to maybe do the work that we've been doing. I think you need to use that as one of your values and drivers to go seek them out.
Thank you. Question here from Jodie, which is again very close to my heart, about audience engagement. Jodie's asking, has the pandemic highlighted the lack of authentic engagement that lots of cultural organisations have had with audiences thus far? And will it galvanise them into developing deeper, more sustained understanding of their audiences? Anyone want to take that one? Portia, maybe. Do you want to come back on that one?
Yeah, so I think that your physical audience and your online audience often are different, but often are exactly the same. So it's kind of the work that you're doing. I think it's very important when you're doing work, if you think in the physical, you're always evaluating what you're doing. You're always evaluating that it's meaningful and has value to the people that you're doing things for. And I think it's exactly the same in the digital world. You've got to make sure that those audiences are having a valuable experience.
Great. I've got two more questions here that are linked. Hassan, sorry, do you want to come in first before I move on?
It was just very briefly to say that when we think about relationship between a cultural institution and its audiences, it's really important just to appreciate the wider, basically how the audiences use their time. You know, I mean, one thing that's really striking for me from this study of cultural consumption behaviors in lockdown is just how much time people still spend on traditional forms of cultural content, and TV in particular. Actually, what we've seen is, so we've been capturing the lockdown period and the post-lockdown period. And what you've seen is in lockdown on various measures, there was increased engagement and a broader based engagement with culture online, including theatres and collections online, you know, less traditional forms of content. But then as individuals came out of lockdown, we saw some of that easing off again. But with TV, it's racing on. People are spending more and more time on television. And we have to ask ourselves, what is that nature of that engagement? Does that necessarily mean that they're passive consumers? There needs to be a much more nuanced understanding about the audience, I suppose, rather than thinking about the siloed relationship between the audience and that institution. It's really understanding the public. That makes sense?
It does, and it leads kind of into Jane Ellison's question, which is, you know, do the panel feel there might be some kind of backlash as we emerge out of COVID? People having enough of the digital and craving face-to-face cultural experiences again. Any thoughts on that? Kim, you're nodding enthusiastically.
Yes, definitely. Just even personally, at the beginning, I wanted to watch everything on streaming. Ooh, the National Theatre is offering something, I can watch it. And then it was about, I wanted to learn. Then there was a whole series of learning. And now I kind of just want to make craft. I want to do things and I want to meet people. And the communities that we've been working with at the beginning wanted us to stay away. It was scarier at the beginning. We didn't know what it was going to be like, COVID. And now I think because it's becoming more normative, they just want us to come back in and get back to doing what they used to do. I think people just want a bit of normalcy and whatever that means now. And so I think, yes, people are getting a little bit fatigued. But I'm sure we'll hold on to elements of this digital engagement, like the home working that we're all probably to some degree enjoying, for example.
Yeah, and it's working so brilliantly now. I think there's a question here from Rob Watson, which is a fascinating one. And Rob says, has the audience paradigm run its course? To go digital, surely it's about thinking in terms of participants, users, and co-creators rather than audiences. As an audience researcher, I hope you're wrong, Rob, but what do the panel think about that one? Hassan, go on.
Just briefly again, sort of going back to our data, I mean, we've definitely seen evidence that, you know, within the context of the cultural consumption behaviors we're analysing, we've definitely seen, you know, the rise of the co-creator. And but the reality is, it's still, insofar as we can capture these using the survey instruments we've used, they're still relatively minority, you know, behaviors. And so for me, it comes back again to the, you know, what is that, you know, what is the balance? What is the audience, genuine audience appetite, right, in cultural engagement for co-creation versus more passive forms of engagement? And historically in the arts, we tended to look down a bit at passive engagement and seeing it as being a sort of a second-rate sort of relative, I suppose, to more active forms of engagement. But I think we probably need to move away from these sort of dichotomous partitions between active and passive forms of engagement. I think passive engagement, what we think of as passive engagement, can often be very active. Actually, we need a much more sort of sophisticated understanding of the way that audiences engage with culture.
Yeah, and there's a lot of emerging research, isn't there, about how cognitively, emotionally, kinesthetically active audiences always are, even when they're sitting seemingly static. So yeah, you're absolutely right, I think. Portia.
So I was just going to add that I think it's a really interesting question, because I think it feeds in a lot, not just digital. If you think in terms of exhibitions, we're trying very much at the moment in our museum to move away from this kind of idea that we write the exhibition on what we find interesting, and that's what, you know, curator knows best, as it were. And it's creating a conversation with your community, with your audience, with your, you know, co-creating things. And I think you know, as you said, having this dichotomy of labels for everyone can be an audience and a participant and a user and a co-creator all at the same time. And it's up to us as cultural organizations to facilitate that and to make sure that we are building that into our work on a daily basis. And I think that spreads further than just digital.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to move out into breakout groups in a minute. I just want to reflect, partly to inform the discussions that we might all have in these groups, from a comment by Robin Simpson here, which I was going to pose to the panel actually, which is this interesting differentiation, or perhaps a lot of people are conflating digital distribution with digital engagement. So, you know, Robin says, is there a danger of thinking of digital as a way of broadcasting content to audiences rather than as an opportunity for interactive engagement? I think this is, for me, this is a key question at the heart of digital engagement and online engagement with audiences. So maybe something people want to pick up on as well in the breakout groups. So bear with me, I have my instructions to read to you about the breakout groups. You should, in 2 or 3 minutes, be seamlessly taken into a smaller breakout group. So they'll be about 10 minutes long, and the idea is to give everyone an opportunity for some quickfire networking and a chance to get a sense of what other people across different sectors of the cultural industry are saying and thinking, and to share your own experiences. There'll be a question that will appear hopefully magically on the slide in a minute. Here we go. What are the gains and losses when face-to-face engagement with cultural audiences shifts online? We'll post that also into the chat functions in your breakout group, so you have it handy. I hope you had a good 5 minutes, and thanks so much to everyone who's posted in the chat. I'm struggling to keep up with it, which is a really good sign. Hopefully other people will have been able to scroll through it as well. Please do feel free to message me or put your hands up if you'd like to actually ask a question live. It'd be good to hear some other voices come in, as well as mine and the panel. Just to kick off this second half of the event, I've got one question that I've picked up from some of the summaries so far, which is a question about do you think people are engaging in new kinds of cultural activity online, or is it really a case of more of the same? So has the lockdown really kind of sparked people to engage in different ways and be more omnivorous? Any thoughts from our panel on that one? Hassan, go on.
So certainly the evidence from our work is that there has been significant numbers of individuals trying new content that's new to them for the first time. Even in areas which you intuitively thought would be quite expensive, actually, like video games, you know, there appears to be a significant number, and that has broadly persisted, although time will tell, you know, some evidence that's tailing off a bit. So who knows what the long-term impact will be. Also, your point about cultural, there's a date, we're still analysing this data, but there seems to be an interesting phenomenon whereby on average people are increasing the number of different types of content they engage with. So in some sense, consumers appear in lockdown to be getting more omnivorous. Now that seems to be quite a strong finding. We're still trying to get to the bottom of it, but I think now that's different, of course, to whether they're engaging with generally new forms of experience altogether, you know, new to the sector, as it were. But in terms of trying new things, there appears to have been some not insignificant amount of activity. And
people are discovering poetry. Thank goodness for that, Sandy. Thank you. Do any of the other panelists want to come back on that question? Is it changing people's cultural habits and tastes, or is it more of the same? Michie, yeah.
I mean, I can only speak for the small bit of the world that I look at, I guess. But from a focus groups, just even small changes in habit are significant. You know, we found some people were watching National Theatre at home and creating date nights with their loved one, and setting up their sound system to get the most out of the TV. So people are, you know, being different and trying being different, in sometimes enabled by culture, and others were doing something where they were watching a live broadcast and following a tweet along with the playwright. You know, this is all. I don't know, when the person asked the question, I don't know what they're envisioning the scale of new activities are, but I can say that I've seen some evidence of just being different and trying something that's new for them.
Yeah, and I guess that extends your point from earlier about, you know, the mediation and our cultural organisations ready to kind of let and encourage almost audiences to engage with their content in very, very different ways, and to relinquish control. And we had these debates, didn't we, around social media and around tweet seats and all sorts of things. Have any of you got thoughts on that? You know, to what extent is the sector ready to give up more control and let people decide for themselves on their own terms how they engage with culture? Yeah, Portia.
Well, I think this just keeps reminding me of the way that we approach exhibitions. So when kind of writing exhibition content, you think of your audience in 3 different categories. You have paddlers, swimmers, and divers. And so paddlers will only read headlines, titles. Swimmers will read your first paragraph, and divers will read every single piece of text that you've written and put in there. And we very much approach all exhibitions to try and cater for all 3 types of audience. So I think that's quite important to do, to recognise that you have people who will engage in very, very different ways. And you can't cater for everyone, but it's important to try and at least understand that there are differences in the ways that people engage with what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this whole thing is posing huge challenges, isn't it, strategically and ethically, of course, for cultural organisations. There was inevitably quite a lot here in the chat around, you know, the implications on geography and how, of course, digital has enabled people, you know, myself included, to watch far more National Theatre performances than probably is good for anybody, wonderful as they are. But this, you know, the ability to break down barriers and borders, and of course expenses of travelling across the country. And someone else made the point that it's stimulated international engagement with culture and built new relationships. How important is that, do you think, this you know, ability of the digital to break down traditional barriers to engagement across geographic boundaries? Yeah, Kim.
We've found it's been fascinating. So normally what we would do, because we co-commission with communities, is take go and see trips to inspire, catch ideas. We are based in Plymouth, so our geographical ability to travel is quite limited. Bristol might be at a push that would take a lot of effort. So now with the digital, when we're talking to communities about the potential for projects that they could have, we can pull them from everywhere. We can invite speakers from other countries, other community members from other countries who have also done co-commissioning processes, to speak to our communities and share ideas. So it's been really fascinating and useful in a global sense to connect people who normally are operating in a very hyper-local way.
Rishi, yeah.
There's an economist, Tyler Cowen, I think his name is, and he has an interesting take on it, which, away from the digital, what he says is, in parts of the world, you have, for example, local artisans who make incredible things that the world can't see. And then what happens is, when their work becomes commercialized, or, you know, a tourist cruise boat goes to that part of the world, suddenly their work can be seen by everyone. which sounds good, or by more people, but then they change their work to suit the tastes of their now global audience. And is that good? So he always talks about this dichotomy of what happens when your local good reaches a wider audience. And I think I'm fascinated by that argument. I think it's a really interesting argument that we should start to think about for culture as well. You know, there's going to be a trade-off, isn't there, between suddenly everyone's seeing something they've never seen before, but then does that change how that thing is produced to meet the tastes of its new audience?
Sorry. I was going to say that's really interesting. And just so much as, you know, places that are doing things for themselves in a really small way that's profound, once it starts being shared, also might feel a little bit under a lens and maybe not as risk-taking against, and maybe somehow the offer will even out a bit and we won't get those spikes of innovation and risk.
Hassan, you were going to come in.
Just a brief comment on a point that Rishi was making about Tyler Cowen, sort of, you know, characterization of globalization leading to a change in the product. Obviously, that's sort of not one thought that struck in my mind is that's not inevitable, of course. And in trade, if you think about international trade agreements, and of course the UK is going to be thinking a lot about this with Brexit, you know, the principle of cultural exceptions is sort of well embedded, right? The idea that there needs to be some sort of forms of protection, without wanting to use a loaded word, but to protect, you know, the cultural uniqueness of nations' cultural offers. And of course, it raises the question in a digital context, what does that mean, right? I mean, obviously, one of the big headaches that trade negotiators have is digital services, frankly, because they're intangible and they're very difficult to regulate. And so it does raise that question, is it inevitable that process that Rishi set out? And one would hope not.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question here from Hannah. Hannah, I don't know if you want to ask this live or if you'd rather I read it out. I'll just give you a minute if you want to turn on your camera and ask Rishi.
Hey, I can.
Hi.
Hi. So Rishi, since the National Theatre's been broadcasting to cinemas, you know, around the world for a while, you know, could you reflect on how, since that streaming has been happening, like pre-pandemic, how did that change programming there?
Or has it changed programming?
Or has it, right? Has it and how?
Has it, and if so, how? Yeah. That's one for Rishi. Did you get that one, Rishi? I think he might have frozen. We've lost Rishi. We'll have to come back to that one. Apologies. Sandy, you've got a question.
Yeah, or an observation. I find that the context of the cultural exception and so on. We've been working with this for 40 or 50 years in our legislation in Canada, of course, and our public broadcasters have played a key role, obviously, in maintaining a sense of ourselves. But I don't think they've adapted to the digital world as well as I'd like, as often big unwieldy organizations don't. I just wanted to know in Britain if you feel that the BBC, for instance, can hold you together digitally. And obviously you have to market, you have to compete with everyone else. But I'm thinking that we might need a new model here, and they've just tabled a new Broadcast Act, and it's an interesting, down in the weeds. But that issue of, can we create, without becoming protectionist and isolationist, can we create a digital space where our countrymen, if you will, whoever lives in our geopolitical space, can get together and share things?
Great question. And any thoughts on that, Hassan? You've unmuted yourself, which is a good sign.
So I don't know where I think about this yet. But one thing I would say is that public service. In your question about in the UK, so the BBC clearly has always sort of had an opportunity or tension, as it were, between sort of a UK audience and a global audience, right? Because of the particular place the BBC plays in the global PSB landscape, and obviously it's historically done it reasonably well. There has been this program called Culture in Quarantine, which you may be familiar with, which is a major sort of program. Of course, it may familiar with for UK audiences, maybe not in Canada, but it's been a partnership between the BBC, I think, and Arts Council England and others to really offer a rich and vibrant cultural offer online. Now, the BBC hasn't yet said anything about what the audience engagement has been with that. I'd be interested to know, for example, what sort of audience have engaged? Have they been mainly international, national? I think it's a good test case, and it's been a nice experiment of a fairly well-resourced program to try and offer a digital culture offer. The reason why I'm a bit stuck about what I think about this is I was saying this to the other panelists at the beginning of the event, that I really can't get my head around what it means to have a local identity digitally at the moment. But it's really important, right? Because even at a local place level, right, we're used to sort of working to a local community because by virtue of where our venues are based. But if we're digital, is it possible to have a local digital identity? I don't know, but I think it's probably an important question, even if I don't know the answer. Right.
Yeah, it's a great example, isn't it? The culture in quarantine. I wonder if that has been replicated around the world, actually, that kind of national program during lockdown.
I'm certainly going to investigate that and see if we have it here.
Yeah, it's a great. There are others as well. I think Museums at Home was one, and I guess they pre-exist COVID, don't they? We have, on Twitter, Museum Hour once a week, where museums professionals in the UK, I think it's UK or not global, convene to discuss kind of latest issues in the museum sector. We've got Rishi back, so before I'll come back to you in a sec, Hassan. Did you catch Hannah's question, Rishi?
Yeah, I did. Thanks, Hannah. Good question. So at the NT, the fact that we've got the possibility to stream doesn't affect what gets programmed on the stages. So there's a conscious decision not to bring that in as a factor with the artistic direction, basically, so that the artistic decisions can be made for the reasons they need to be made for what works on stage. We do have a strand of work which is sort of digital only, so that's never intended for the stage. So for example, our immersive storytelling studio will produce work that might be designed to be seen through a virtual reality headset. So that's obviously a completely different thing. That's digital at its birth all the way through.
Another strand I want to pick up on from your conversation that you posted in the chat is obviously what's lost. And there were quite a few references to the lack of audience-to-audience engagement. What we're missing is the ability of culture to build communities, deepen connections between communities. And again, maybe harks back to this idea of the hyper-local and what that means in this digital world. So has any of the panel got any thoughts, or indeed anyone else got any thoughts they'd like to share on this idea of how important face-to-face contact is and audience-to-audience contact is for engagement with culture and meaning making, perhaps, and community building? Kim? So you're still muted, I think.
For us, that's what we do. We're a socially engaged arts organization. Our relevance is in having face-to-face time with people, time to make relationships, time to go down routes and do something messy and then fix it again and try something else new, time to have conversations and cups of tea, and build trust, really. So I desperately want us to get back to being analog. There'll be elements of the digital that we will take forward with us, definitely. But I think at our core, our way of working is still on the ground in communities, and it's very valuable in terms of relationships.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing here, and lots of people are nodding, is digital and analog it's an and not an either or, and it's about the right strategy for digital and the right strategy for face-to-face. And there are comments here about how difficult it is to replicate those special experiences that we have face-to-face with arts, culture, heritage, screen, as opposed to online. I mean, Portia first, and then I'll maybe ask the question of how easy is it to curate a special digital cultural experience? But Portia.
Well, I was just going to say that, yeah, it's the face-to-face is just so important, and it's not something for us as an organization, it's not something we'd ever consider, you know, stopping. We always want that face-to-face experience. You can't beat having a child in a museum looking at the remains of a Roman bathhouse and that context. You can't beat that with a digital platform. But I think that it's this whole thing of and you know, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that having a digital offer often draws people in to your museum. It kind of fosters that knowledge of you and what you do and what's there, and then people want to come in for that experience. So it's the digital is something that I think organizations need to use to complement the analog, that what they're already doing.
Yeah, and I think those of us here who teach students are certainly seeing that it's so much easier to make digital work effectively if you've already built a sense of community face-to-face first. It's very difficult to do it without that as a starting point, really. Jeff, I wondered if you would like to come in. You posted a couple of examples from the Cultural Value Project around digital engagement. Would you like to say a little bit more about those?
Well, I've got to remember what was in them now, because it's about 5 years ago that they were done.
On the spot, they sound really relevant.
And they were one of 70 pieces of work. Nonetheless, I do remember that the work that David Beale did on, and I think it was the Shetlands, it may even have been the Hebrides, I can't remember. But these local history societies, they have a Gaelic name which makes them very significant. They apparently virtually every adult in those communities would be a member of their local history society. And what they tried to do with research project was actually to develop digital archives for people to work with and see what that did for the community. And the answer was, my recollection is that actually it was pretty effective and people were engaging with them seriously. And it didn't seem to damage the character of the experiences the community experiences they were building. My recollection of the work that, I remember the name, Studdert, I think, Cardiff, was using Facebook for local history societies. And my recollection, and God, you shouldn't remember in one slogan the outcome of a 60-page report, but my recollection is that it didn't work very well, that it wasn't as exciting. And I think there's actually an interesting contrast then between those two, if my recollections of them are correct, which is that where there is a strong local base of existing relationships, the digital can enhance that and engage people even more. Whereas it can't, if I'm basing it just on those two examples, it can't build something that wasn't there at all in the first place.
Yeah, so maybe some more evidence there of the need for digital to be complementary and not a replacement. Never is a replacement, I think, as we all know.
Well, you say, we had some research on, not a replacement in terms of, if you're talking about local engagement, but we have some research that was done on global music writing and music consuming networks, which showed that something totally new was created. As a result of that, that could never have existed, and that people were composing together around different cities in the world. They were people in Berlin and in LA and in London were composing together, and they could never have done so without that site. The interesting thing is that they were all clustering. It was people in certain cities that were composing together. It wasn't spreading it. It was spreading it geographically to other big cities, but it wasn't spreading it to communities of people who weren't part of big cities. And so that again raises really interesting questions about what the nature of digital engagement is when it's engagement, not just audiences, is that whether actually you still have to be locked into certain networks before you take part in those. It's this contrast we've kept saying, the contrast between digital and physical is simply too neat. We need much more nuanced ways of thinking about it.
Great, thanks very much, Jeff. Helen, you've got a question. Would you like to ask it yourself, or it's around subscription? Helen Palmer.
Sorry, I didn't really set it up as a question, but I'm happy to raise the point. I'm just seeing that there's a number of the larger arts organisations who are starting to set up digital subscription services. I've referenced English National Ballet and Rambert, particularly because I'm a dance fan, so I'm very aware of those. And I was just saying it'd be interesting to see what the levels of engagement are in the long term, and the kinds of audiences, whether it's going to be the same kinds of audiences who would normally be engaging, whether it is going to generate new audiences, and how sustainable they will be as platforms in the long term.
Right, and thank you for transposing that into a question. Any responses to that? I've always been struck by how behind, in a way, the UK is on subscription models compared to, say, Australia, where certainly, you know, like Melbourne Theatre Company used to have about 80% of its audience base were regular subscribers. I think most cultural organisations here would kill for that. Yeah, any thoughts on this shift in business model and kind of audience loyalty, Hassan?
Well, just one very obvious point, I suppose, to make is that one of the advantages of subscription streaming platforms, if you can set one up, and it's easier and easier to do that, of course, over time, right? It's just become, it's more, it's a more of a tractable challenge, frankly, for even smaller organizations, as long as, of course, they've got the IP, the content, right? So the key issue is are arts organizations doing the IP deals that allow them to feed a streaming platform is the question. And there have been many examples of the R&D fund. You know, we funded at Nesta many years ago. We funded experiments in these platforms. What invariably failed was if you didn't have enough of the right content and the right marketing, and that's where the costs are. But the obvious point to say, the example I give actually is Darbar, which I just mentioned in the chat. I'm on the board of Darbar, so full disclosure. But it's really interesting how it's a South Asian classical music sort of agency or a centre of expertise, puts on, you know, famously historical sort of live events, first in the UK and then globally. But digitally, they've got a massive following. I mean, it's gigantic. I think compared with other Arts Council NPOs, it may be the biggest, right? And that includes a large amount of Indian, so South Asian classical music, but they've got Indian fans, right? So they basically get a global audience. It's a very basic point, but you can get a global audience in a way that's very difficult to do, of course, if you're just based on, you know, a live venue. And I say it's really interesting here. We've got a British-based South Asian classical music organization, which is recruiting masses of fans from India. So we're actually, you know, competing with. So I think it's a very interesting space to look at, and it's one that until fairly recently was prohibitively costly. But if you've got the content and you've got the IP and you've got the networks, so you can afford to market, it's definitely worth looking at.
Thanks, and I think, yeah, the last 2 points really raise this question, and someone else has raised this in the chat, about the particular challenges for small organisations and independent artists, of course, whether you're thinking about subscription models or live streaming. What are the particular challenges that small organisations face, do people think, and how might they overcome those? I know we had Vika in the room somewhere from Yorkshire Dance. She might want to come in at some point. Portia.
Well, I was just going to say kind of a couple of things. One point on the whole subscription idea. Obviously, we're a museum, so we don't have subscriptions, but there's definitely a shift, I think, from digital equals free. I think particularly at the beginning of lockdown, you saw a lot of people thinking that museums should be putting all their digital content out there for free. And there's very much a shift that people are accepting that actually it doesn't necessarily have to be free if it's the right price point and it's the right quality. So, you know, we're finding it quite interesting with our consultation with teachers, with our virtual field trips, how that kind of, where that slots in and how it kind of fits in with that. I think the small organizations, we were discussing this a little bit in our little breakout room, but I think one of the biggest challenges is resources, it's skills, it's time, it's, you know, the ability to develop digital content with quality when, you know, if you're take museums, you're a really small museum, you don't have many staff, you don't have an IT department probably, you know, really, really small things like that can be such a barrier to creating digital content. So I think it's, you know, it's very difficult for small museums to then wade into this world of national theatres and national museums doing these amazing things. And I would say that kind of comes back to that community thing. I think small museums, it's all about who your audience is, and it's your local community. And if it's digital is right for them, then that's great. If it's not, then, you know, maybe small museums don't need to be quite as worried about jumping on the digital bandwagon, as it were.
Yeah, and there's a very good point from Lizzie Ridley here around that, you know, the brilliant innovations from some small organisations on a local level, and certainly, you know, organisations like Slung Low in Leeds have been inspiring in the way they've responded to the crisis, both digitally and, you know, setting up food banks, etc. But this question of what it means to be relevant, I think now is more important than ever for cultural organisations. We've got about 1 or 2 minutes left, and I've got a couple of questions for Rishi, unless anyone has a burning question, they want to put their hand up. Just things I want to come back to. One, I mean, this question of the business model. So, you know, I don't know how much you can disclose, Rishi, but how did it work for NT in terms of the business model? And I was intrigued by this thing of date nights at NT. How did you find that out? There's a question there about methods, and you said earlier about the limitations of, you know, analytics here. So what are the implications for audience research going forward, and is it the holy grail, or a holy grail for a business model?
Okay, yeah. So business models. I mean, one's there's so much to say and not enough time. But one dichotomy I sometimes use is head and heart. So if you give it for free, and then you say, look, if you'd like to donate, and people know it's a really hard time for freelancers in particular, and they get some money from it as well, then that's a heart thing. And we've been really bowled over by how generous audiences have been with donations, you know, us, but all around the sector as much as possible. I mean, it's never enough, is it, for an ailing sector, but there's been a lot of generosity. So that's a heart thing. I think when you're talking about subscription, when you mention the word subscription service, people go straight to head, audiences do, and they start calculating how many subscription services do I want? Will I watch it in time? I think it's a hard sell nowadays to make it a purely head decision. And it also sells the art that you're trying to, if you are trying to do a subscription service, it makes it transactional. So I think that the skill is in your marketing people to really, what is the message and what is the proposition? What are you selling? And you've got to really just, I think, was it Portia, I think, was saying that, you know, it's not so much about free anymore, which I agree with, but beyond that, you also need to think about what your message is and what your relationship is with audiences, because even if they accept digital isn't for free, they still need a proposition that appeals to the heart as well. And the other question around research methods.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that digital metrics can be useful, but I feel you definitely need to flesh them out. Focus groups, and then also are a really good way to do that. Having a framework which you can then put out via a survey is also really good. You know, you've got to experiment with the framework that works for you. What tells you what people will really do in the future? And then Hassan is much more the expert on more sophisticated methods, like, you know, revealed preference and looking at people's behaviors beyond what they say as well. But I think all I would say is I think you need to go a bit beyond digital metrics, because they're somewhat useful, but they don't tell the whole story.
Absolutely. You can never beat talking to your audience members, in my experience. I'm really sorry I have to wrap this up, and I'm really loath to do that, and I can sense we could go on for another hour or two, but it's been a really interesting and engaging event, and I want to have a massive thank you to the panel members for giving of their time and experiences so generously. It's been really, really inspiring to hear all of those examples and really complementary perspectives you brought to this, so thank you. A huge thanks to all of you for participating. It's lovely to see. I think we had 200 at one point, which is more than double what we expected. But it worked. I hope it worked really well for you. It certainly has from our perspective. Please do keep in touch. This is the start, really, of the Centre for Cultural Values delivery of our programme. We will be putting on future events over the next 4 years. So if you haven't already, please do sign up to our mailing list, have a look at our sparkling new website, which will showcase all of the forthcoming events and initiatives such as the MOOC that we're working on or will be in a couple of years, our evaluation principles, our Collaborate Fund, which is to bring cultural organisations together in partnership with academic researchers, and evaluation working groups. So there's lots of things to keep us all busy online, and hopefully soon we'll be able to meet face to face and have that Friday afternoon well-earned glass of wine. So thank you very much. The chat will stay open for probably 10 minutes now. So if you want to hang around and keep talking in the chat, please do. You're very welcome to do that. The last thing I need to say is a huge thank you to Trish, who has captioned all of our live events over the past 2 weeks, which is a phenomenal effort. So a huge thank you to Trish, and a massive thank you also to our partners in Canada, who have really buoyed us up and supported us and brought in a Canadian contingent that's been really welcome to get that international perspective. And finally, as you can see on your slides, we are bribing you shamelessly. I'm not a fan of incentives for research methods usually, but I've been overruled. So there is a £50 book voucher to complete an evaluation survey. And in all seriousness, we really welcome your feedback. These events are new to all of us. We want to do them as effectively and engagingly and interactively as we possibly can. So I promise it will only take you 5 minutes, and I think Tamsin is going to post a link to the feedback form in the chat. But thanks again, that's all from us for now. Have a lovely weekend, and we will see all of you online or face-to-face soon. Take care.